The kitchen clock had stopped ticking months ago, but Sarah still heard it in her head, counting down towards something she couldn't stop. 72 hours. That's what the letter on the counter said, pinned beneath a chipped coffee mug like it needed weight to keep it from floating away, from becoming less real. Notice of foreclosure auction, the header read, in a font too clean, too indifferent, for something that was about to erase her entire life. She stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, arms crossed over a paint-stained sweater, watching dust drift through the last light of a Tuesday afternoon. Half the boxes were sealed. The other half sat open, gutted, like she couldn't bring herself to finish what she'd started. This house had a smell, cedar and old rain, and something underneath that, something like memory. It clung to the walls the way her grandmother's voice still clung to these rooms, even 5 years after she'd stopped speaking it out loud. Sarah pressed her palm flat against the doorframe, feeling the notch her grandmother used to mark her height every summer. 72 hours. In 3 days, strangers would stand in this yard with paddles and cold calculations, deciding what her family's life was worth in dollars. She didn't know yet that the answer waiting beneath her feet would be worth far more than any of them imagined. She only knew the clock was still running, and she was almost out of time. Sarah had spent her whole life almost getting somewhere, almost finishing college before her mother got sick and the money ran out, almost saving enough for a place of her own before her husband left and took the last of their savings with him, almost keeping this farm afloat, 3 years running, on a waitress's tips and a prayer that the next season would be different. It never was. She was 8 years old when her grandmother, Eleanor, took her in, a wiry, sharp-eyed woman who smelled like flower and rosemary and never once raised her voice, not even when the roof leaked or the bank called. Eleanor had built a life here out of stubbornness and dirt under the fingernails faith, and she'd tried, in her quiet way, to pass that same stubbornness down. "This land doesn't owe you easy," Eleanor used to say, kneading dough at the counter Sarah now stared at through tired eyes. "It just owes you honest." Sarah had believed that once. Now she had a 6-year-old daughter asleep in the back bedroom, a stack of unpaid bills thick enough to choke on, and a farm that had given her nothing but memories and mounting debt since Eleanor passed. She'd tried everything: a second job, a loan she couldn't qualify for, a buyer who backed out at the last minute. Every road led back here. To this kitchen. To this deadline. She wasn't just losing a house. She was losing the last place her daughter would ever know her great-grandmother's kitchen, her garden, her ghost. Some inheritances weren't written in a will. Some just lived in the walls. Sarah moved through the house the way you move, through a memory you're not ready to leave. The hallway floorboards groaned under her feet, the same familiar creak she'd learned to skip over as a teenager sneaking in past curfew. She trailed her fingers along the wallpaper, faded roses, peeling at the seams, and let herself remember Eleanor humming old hymns while she dusted these same walls on Sunday mornings. In the sitting room, the afternoon light fell in long amber bars across the worn oak floor. Sarah knelt beside the old rocking chair, its arms smoothed pale by decades of hands, and pressed her palm to the seat where her grandmother used to sit her down for stories that always started the same way. "Now, this land has secrets, if you know how to listen." She'd always thought Eleanor meant it as a lesson, a metaphor, not a fact. In the kitchen, she ran her hand along the counter's scorch mark from a Thanksgiving gone wrong. In the garden, she touched the leaning fence post Eleanor refused to fix because crooked things still hold up fine, if their roots are good. Room by room, she said goodbye, not just to a house, but to a version of herself that had once felt safe here, rooted here, home. Back in the sitting room, she paused one last time, breathing in the cedar and rain smell she'd carry with her forever. She turned to leave. And that's when her boot caught the edge of a floorboard that gave, just slightly beneath her weight. Something underneath wasn't right. Sarah froze. Floors in a house this old settled and groaned. She knew every one of their voices by heart. But this wasn't a groan. This was a shift, a give, the unmistakable sound of something hollow. She knelt down, heart quickening for reasons she couldn't yet explain, and pressed her palm flat against the board. It sank half an inch under her touch, then stopped, resisting like it was hiding something on purpose. This land has secrets if you know how to listen. Eleanor's voice rose up from memory, and for the first time, it didn't sound like a metaphor at all. Sarah worked her fingers into the seam at the edge of the board, nails scraping against decades of dust and dried varnish. It didn't want to move, but eventually, with a groan of old nails finally giving up their grip, the board lifted free. Beneath it, not soil, not subfloor, but a black rectangle of empty space. Cold air breathed up out of the gap, carrying the mineral scent of stone and something older, earth that hadn't seen daylight in a very long time. She pulled a second board free, then a third, her pulse thudding in her ears louder than the creak of old wood. What emerged was a narrow set of stone steps, descending sharply into darkness, swallowed after only a few feet by shadow so complete it felt deliberate. Someone had built this. Someone had sealed it shut, boards nailed down tight enough to fool 60 years of footsteps walking right over the top of it. Sarah sat back on her heels, staring into the dark, her breath shallow. Why would anyone hide a staircase beneath their own home? And why, she thought, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the draft rising from below. Why did it feel like it had been waiting for her? Sarah grabbed the old flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the one Eleanor kept for storms, and made her way back to the gap in the floor. Her hands weren't quite steady as she swung the beam down into the dark. The stairs held, barely wide enough for one person. They dropped into a small stone cellar untouched by time, cobwebs thick as gauze curtains, the air heavy with dust and something faintly metallic. Her flashlight swept over crates stacked against the far wall, their wood gone soft and gray with age. And in the corner, half buried beneath a moth-eaten blanket, a strongbox. Sarah crouched beside it, brushing away decades of dust to reveal two initials stamped into the metal lid, Yem Eleanor Marsh. Her grandmother's box, hidden beneath her own home, sealed away for who knew how long. The lock was rusted, brittle. It gave way easily under the pressure of an old garden trowel. Inside, a leather journal, its pages soft and yellowed, and beneath it, a bundle of papers tied with twine that Sarah didn't yet dare to touch. She opened the journal with trembling fingers. Eleanor's handwriting, unmistakable, filled the first page, but the words made no sense at first glance. References to the arrangement, to a name Sarah had never once heard spoken in this family, Holt. Underlined twice, hard enough to tear the paper. Near the bottom of the page, in ink darker than the rest, as if written in a different, more urgent moment. Never sell to them, no matter what they offer, no matter what they threaten. Some debts aren't meant to be paid in money. Sarah stared at the words, cold seeping up through the stone floor. Who were they? And what had Eleanor been protecting all these years? The knock came just after 6, sharp and confident, the kind of knock that expected an answer. Sarah shoved the journal beneath a stack of folded towels before she opened the door, some instinct faster than thought telling her not to let anyone see it yet. Mayor Richard Holt stood on her porch in a suit too pressed for a Tuesday evening, flanked by a black car idling in the drive like it was impatient to leave. He was smiling the way men like him always smiled, warm on the surface, calculating underneath. "Sarah," he said, like they were old friends, though she could count their conversations on one hand. "I heard about the auction. Terrible business. I thought I'd save you the trouble." He held out a folder. Inside, an offer. Cash, full amount, no inspection, no contingencies, nearly triple what the land had appraised for. Enough to erase every debt she carried and start over somewhere new. Enough to make her question everything. "You could sign tonight," Holt said, "and this could all be over by morning." Sarah stared at the number, then at him. Men like Holt didn't overpay for a struggling farm out of kindness. He owned half the county already, strip malls, parking lots, a golf course that had swallowed 3 family orchards whole. He didn't need this land. So why did he want it enough to show up in person, cash offer in hand, the same day she'd found a hidden cellar and a name written in her grandmother's own trembling ink? Holt. The same name underlined twice on a page, not 12 feet from where they stood. "I need time to think," she said carefully, watching something flicker behind his practiced smile. Impatience, maybe, or the faintest trace of worry. Time, Holt said softly, is the one thing you don't have, Sarah. He left his card. He didn't leave a reason. The county library smelled like old paper and radiator heat, and Sarah had never been more grateful for either. She sat at a corner table with the county archive box the librarian had pulled for her, a woman named Margaret, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, who'd worked there long enough to remember things the internet never bothered to record. Marshland, Margaret said, settling into the chair across from her, voice lowered like the subject itself required discretion. Now, there's a name I haven't heard in a while. Your grandmother's place, isn't it? Sarah nodded, sliding the folder of property records across the table. Someone offered to buy it, way above market. Same day, I found out about the auction. Margaret's expression shifted. Not surprise, exactly. Recognition. Let me guess. Richard Holt. Sarah's stomach tightened. You know him? Everyone knows him. Margaret leaned in. But what most people don't know is that your farm's had offers before. Before you were even born, I'd wager. My mother used to talk about it, said there were men sniffing around that land back in the 80s, and before that too, going back to right after your great-grandfather passed. Offers nobody could explain, for a piece of land that never grew much of anything worth that kind of money. Why? Sarah's voice came out barely above a whisper. That, Margaret said, is the question nobody ever got a straight answer to. Eleanor never sold, never even entertained it from what I heard. Just quietly turned every one of them away, decade after decade. Sarah thought of the warning in the journal. Never sell to them, no matter what they offer. Decades of offers. Decades of refusal. And now, with Eleanor gone and the auction closing in, someone was finally running out of patience. Sarah checked her watch. 51 hours remained until the gavel fell, until whatever her grandmother had spent a lifetime protecting could pass into the hands of a stranger. Night had fully settled over the farm by the time Sarah descended into the cellar again, flashlight clenched between her teeth as she pried open the twine-bound bundle beside the journal. Inside, a survey map, brittle at the folds, dated 1954. Her great-grandfather's signature sat at the bottom beside another she didn't recognize, a surveyor's stamp, official and precise, marking boundary lines across the farm that didn't match the property lines she'd grown up with. A section of the land, nearly 2 acres near the old creek bed, had been quietly redrawn, folded into a separate parcel entirely. Tucked behind the map was a ledger, Eleanor's handwriting once more, columns of numbers Sarah didn't understand yet. Dates, initials, small sums paid out over years, like hush money handed down one careful installment at a time. The arrangement, the journal had called it. Sarah sat back against the cold stone wall, pieces shifting into place, without yet forming a picture. Whatever this was, it had started before Eleanor. Before the farm even belonged to their family, the way she'd always believed it did. A sound from upstairs made her go still. Tires on gravel. Slow and deliberate, then silence. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time and eased back the curtain. A dark sedan sat at the edge of her driveway, engine idling, headlights off. It didn't move. It didn't leave. It just watched. Her phone buzzed on the counter a moment later. Unknown number. Hello. Silence on the other end, not empty but occupied, someone breathing, listening, deciding whether to speak. Then a click. And the line went dead. Sarah's hands weren't steady as she set the phone down. She told herself it was nothing. A wrong number. A neighbor turning around in the wrong driveway. But when she looked back out the window minutes later, the sedan was gone, vanished as quietly as it had come, leaving only tire tracks pressed into the frost. The call from the bank came at 9 the next morning, clipped and apologetic in the way people sound when they're delivering bad news they didn't choose but won't fight either. The auction had been moved up. 36 hours, not 51. A scheduling adjustment, the loan officer called it, though Sarah heard the discomfort underneath his words, like he knew exactly whose hand had pushed that particular lever and didn't like it any more than she did. She stood in the kitchen gripping the phone long after the call ended, the walls of the old house suddenly feeling smaller, tighter, like the deadline itself had physical weight. That afternoon, a second visit, not Holt this time, but two men in plain jackets who claimed to be surveying for the county. They didn't have paperwork. They didn't have names, she could later confirm. They walked her property line near the creek bed with a familiarity that unsettled her more than any threat could have, then left without a word of explanation. She barely slept that night. Around 2 a.m, a sound pulled her upright in bed, not the house settling, but something deliberate. A scrape at the back door. The soft, testing pressure of someone checking whether it was locked. Sarah froze, her daughter's door just down the hall, her own heartbeat roaring in her ears. She grabbed her phone, thumb hovering over the call button, and flicked on every light in the house at once. The scraping stopped. Footsteps retreated across the porch, unhurried, almost casual. The footsteps of someone who wasn't afraid of being caught, only inconvenienced by the interruption. By morning, nothing was broken. Nothing was taken. But the message was unmistakable. Someone wanted her gone before she found what Eleanor had spent a lifetime protecting, and they were done being subtle about it. Sarah sat at the kitchen table as dawn broke, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, staring at the journal, the ledger, the survey map spread before her like pieces of a puzzle finally worth finishing. Whatever was buried beneath this farm, it was worth more than money. It was worth silencing her for. Sarah went back down into the cellar one final time, 29 hours before the auction, driven by something sharper than curiosity now, necessity. She ran her hands along every stone wall, every seam in the floor, the way she imagined Eleanor must have done decades before her. In the far corner, behind the crates, her fingers caught on something that didn't belong, a hairline crack running too straight, too deliberate, to be natural where an old stone. She pressed. The panel gave. Behind it, a second, smaller chamber, untouched by decades of dust because it had never once let air inside. Sarah's flashlight swept over a metal chest, military green beneath the grime, a faded stencil on its lid too worn to fully read except for 3 letters and a number, fragments of a unit designation from a war that had ended 80 years before she was born. Her hands trembled as she worked the latch free. Inside, bundled currency, brittle with age, alongside a small velvet pouch that clinked softly when she lifted it, coins, dulled with time but unmistakably gold. Beneath both, protected in oilcloth gone stiff with decades of careful preservation, lay a folded document bearing a seal Sarah recognized from the survey map upstairs. A mineral and subsurface rights deed, dated 1951. Her great-grandfather's name at the bottom, granting full ownership of everything beneath this land. Not just soil, but whatever ran below it.
Oil.
Oregon resources some post-war survey had apparently discovered and never made public. And stapled behind it, newer, the ink far less faded. Correspondence. Letters spanning decades, addressed to Eleanor, each one signed by a different generation of the same family. Holt. Sarah sat back hard against the stone, the pieces finally slamming into place all at once. The mayor didn't want her farmhouse. He'd never wanted the farmhouse. He wanted what lay beneath it, rights his own family had apparently tried to buy, then bury, then quietly steal back for 3 generations, ever since a wartime survey revealed exactly what this worthless land was sitting on. Eleanor hadn't been protecting a house. She'd been protecting a fortune and the truth of who it truly belonged to. Every offer, every threat, every car parked in the dark outside her window. It all led back here, to a hole in the ground her grandmother had guarded with silence for 60 years, waiting for someone brave enough, or desperate enough, to finally dig deep enough to find it. Sarah wiped the dust from the deed with trembling hands. 29 hours left. She finally knew exactly what she was fighting for. By sunrise, Sarah wasn't running anymore. She was moving with purpose, the deed and journal pressed flat inside a folder on the passenger seat as she drove into town with 20 hours left on the clock. She went first to a lawyer Margaret had recommended the night before, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Ruiz who'd spent years untangling property disputes nobody else wanted to touch. Ruiz read through the deed twice, then the letters, her expression hardening with each page. This rights deed was never revoked, Ruiz said finally. Which means legally, it's still valid. If this is real, your family owns something worth considerably more than this farm. And if Holt's family has spent decades trying to suppress it, she looked up, that's not just unethical. Depending on what's in these letters, that could be fraud, coercion, maybe worse. Sarah's next stop was the local paper, a small outfit that punched above its weight when it came to county corruption, the kind of place that had been quietly investigating Holt's land deals for months without a solid lead. Within an hour, a reporter named Cole was photographing every document, cross-referencing names, confirming what Margaret had only ever spoken in whispers. By early afternoon, the story broke online, not buried, not quiet, impossible to ignore. Mayor's family tied to decades-long scheme to suppress rights deed on local farmland. Holt arrived at the auction house himself just as bidding was set to begin, his composure cracking for the first time since Sarah had met him. He found her standing at the entrance, Ruiz beside her, phone in hand. "You have no idea what you've done," he said quietly, all pretense of warmth gone. "I know exactly what I've done," Sarah said. "I found what your family's been trying to bury since before I was born." The county auctioneer, informed of the pending legal claim and the sudden press attention, made the call within the hour, auction suspended, pending investigation into ownership and rights disputes. It wasn't over. There would be hearings, filings, more fighting still to come. But for the first time in months, Sarah walked out of that building with her head high. The farm's still hers. The truth finally louder than the silence that had protected it for 60 years. 3 months later, the legal dust had finally settled. The rights deed held up under scrutiny exactly as Ruiz predicted. Decades old, ironclad, undeniably valid. What followed was a quiet but seismic shift. A settlement, a licensing agreement, resources beneath the farm finally accounted for honestly, for the first time in 70 years. It wasn't a fortune overnight, but it was enough. Enough to clear every debt. Enough to secure her daughter's future in a way Sarah had once only dared to hope for. Holt's family's decades-long maneuvering became a matter of public record, a scandal the town would talk about for years. But Sarah found she didn't think about him much anymore. He'd taken up so much space in her fear for so long, and now, standing in her kitchen with morning light spilling gold across the counter, he simply didn't matter. She walked, once more, through the room she'd once said goodbye to. The hallway floorboards still creaked in the same familiar places. The wallpaper roses hadn't faded any less. But everything felt different now, filled with a meaning she finally understood. In the sitting room, she knelt beside the old rocking chair, resting her hand on the same worn armrest Eleanor's hands had smoothed over decades of quiet, protective silence. This land doesn't owe you easy. It just owes you honest. Sarah understood now what her grandmother had never said aloud, that some inheritances weren't about what you left behind, but what you were willing to guard, patiently, silently, for as long as it took. Her daughter's laughter drifted in from the garden, chasing chickens past the leaning fence post Eleanor had refused to fix. Sarah smiled, pressing her palm once more to the notch in the doorframe marking her own childhood height. She wasn't leaving this house. She was staying finally, fully, for good. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, the secret that had once threatened to take everything now stood as the very thing that had saved it all.